All right, here's the third section. Because it radically transformed American government and society, some historians call the American Civil War the Second American Revolution. Notions of freedom were contested and transformed by the war. Union victory secured the North's understanding of freedom as self ownership and owning one's own labor, as opposed to the South's vision of freedom as mastership over others. The war advanced abolitionists' definition of freedom, and Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves reinforced Americans' sense that their nation was a progressive force in world history. Lincoln did the most to link the war with Northern values. The American Civil War was part of a worldwide phenomenon of nation building. Throughout the world, powerful centralized nation states developed, and old countries and new nations emerged where none had ever existed. Modern states consolidated their power and reduced local autonomy. Japan and Argentina are two examples where this occurred and where rapid economic development quickly followed national unification. Lincoln has even been called the American Mazzini or Bismarck, figures who created the nation states in Italy and Germany, respectively. But Lincoln's America, unlike these nations, was based on universal ideas of political democracy, human liberty, and self government. Other nations were based on particular identities of ethnicity, culture, and language. In November 1863, in his Gettysburg Address, commemorating that battle's dead, Lincoln reaffirmed that all men are created equal and stated the war heralded a new birth of freedom. The war forged a new self consciousness, reflected in the increased usage of the word nation instead of union. Lincoln used union 20 times in his inaugural address, and nation did not appear, whereas the Gettysburg Address contained no mention of the Union, but the word nation was used 5 times. The war changed religion. Northern Protestant clergy tried to give the war a religious justification and sanctify the sacrifices of Northern soldiers. In their sermons, they joined Christianity and patriotism into a civic religion, marking the war as God's means of eradicating slavery and truly making America a land of liberty. Confederates were equally convinced that their cause was the Christian cause. Religion also enabled Americans to cope with the horrors of the battlefield and the enormous loss of life caused by the conflict. Coping with death also required massive governmental involvement, notifying next of kin and accounting for dead and missing soldiers. After the war ended, the federal government launched a campaign during Reconstruction to reinter Union War casualties in national military cemeteries. Intensified Northern nationalism made criticism of the war or Lincoln's administration seem treasonous to Republicans. Thousands of opposition newspaper editors, Democratic politicians, opponents of enlistment in the draft, and ordinary civilians were arrested, often arbitrarily. As the Constitution did not clarify who had the authority to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln claimed this right under his presidential war powers, and he suspended it twice for those charged with disloyal activities. The courts generally gave the administration a free hand, and Lincoln even ignored Supreme Court decisions in individual cases. Only in 1866 did the Supreme Court declare it unconstitutional to bring accused persons before military tribunals where civil courts were in operation. While Lincoln was no dictator, the conflict showed that civil liberties were fragile in wartime. The Northern War effort empowered both the federal government and a rising class of capitalist businessmen. Unlike the South, which was economically devastated, the Northern economy flourished. Industrial profits soared from wartime inflation and government contracts to produce supplies, coal, and iron. Mechanization was spurred onward by war demands in boot and shoe production and meat packing. Agricultural production also expanded during the war. The Northern government was committed to rapid economic growth and development, and Congress adopted policies that promoted this and transformed America's financial system. The Homestead Act spurred agricultural development by offering 160 acres of free public land to settlers in the West. The Land Grant College Act helped states establish agricultural and mechanical schools. Congress also made huge grants of money and land for internal improvements, including up to 100 million acres to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific to build the Transcontinental Railroad. This monumental project required 20,000 men to lay track, an enterprise that involved many Chinese contract laborers called coolies by Americans. Hundreds of these workers would perish during the construction of the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad, finished in 1869, expanded the national market, facilitated Western settlement and investment, and sealed the fate of Indians in the West. The war divided Western communities. Jefferson Davis launched a Confederate invasion of New Mexico in 1861. It was defeated the following year, ending Confederate attempts to build power in the West. Because Lincoln removed soldiers from the West to fight in the East, soldiers could not keep white settlers from intruding on Indian land. Conflict between whites and federal troops and the Indians increased. In 1862, Lincoln authorized the use of Indian soldiers in the U.S. Army. Some tribes, like the Cherokee, sided with the Confederacy. Other tribes fought for the federal government. Most Indians made decisions based on what they considered to be the best way to maintain their nation's sovereignty. The U.S. brought Indian Territory under control by 1863. The Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and lands granted to railroads by the federal government exerted pressure on Native nations to continue ceding their lands. Dakota attacks on white farmers in Minnesota led to the sentencing and mass hanging of 338 Indians, the largest official execution in American history. The need to generate revenue to pay for the war transformed America's financial system. To raise funds, the government increased the tariff to record levels, imposed new taxes on production and consumption, and passed the first income tax in American history. The Union government also borrowed more than $2 billion by selling interest-bearing bonds, creating a huge national debt. It also printed more than $400 million of paper money called greenbacks as legal tender. Congress rationalized banking by creating a system of nationally chartered banks required to buy government bonds and allowed to issue banknotes as currency. A heavy tax drove money issued by state banks out of circulation. The United States, with a money supply before the war and an anarchic mix of paper notes issued by state and local banks, during the war had two kinds of national paper money: greenbacks printed by the federal government and notes issued by new national banks. Wartime economic policies handsomely benefited northern manufacturers, railroad businessmen, and financiers. Many captains of industry of the Gilded Age made their fortunes in the war, including iron and steel entrepreneur Andrew Carnegie, the oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, the financiers Jay Gould and J.P. Morgan, and Philip D. Armour, who earned millions supplying beef to the Union Army. As a whole, Union economic policies vastly expanded the power and size of the federal government. The federal budget in 1865 was more than $1 billion, 20 times larger than 1860, and the federal government became the nation's largest employer. For many Northern women, the war created economic opportunity. Women took manufacturing jobs and jobs in male professions such as nursing. Women found jobs as clerks in the expanding federal government. Women maintained a presence after the war in white-collar government jobs, retail sales, and nursing. Women worked as nurses in the armies, and hundreds of thousands of women indirectly supported the armies by raising money and supplies for soldiers and freed slaves. The U.S. Sanitary Commission became a centralized national relief agency to coordinate efforts on the home front. These activities brought women into the public sphere in new ways. The suffrage movement suspended its work during the conflict, but women's contribution to the war effort heightened the sense of many women that they deserved the vote in its aftermath. After the war, Clara Barton and many others continued the suffrage movement. The war and Lincoln's policies divided the North. Republicans called those opposing the war copperheads after a poisonous snake that strikes without warning. Increasing casualties and rapid social change caused internal conflict. States with a large southern-born population like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and cities with large working-class Catholic immigrant populations were at the center of disquiet. The growing power of the federal government challenged local autonomy, most notably in the draft law, which allowed individuals to provide a substitute or pay a fee to escape service. Wage earners resented the huge profits of manufacturers and financiers while inflation eroded their pay. The war saw the rebirth of the Northern labor movement, which called many strikes. Prospective changes in the status of blacks sparked a racist backlash in much of the North. Although divided between anti-war and pro-war wings, the Democratic Party criticized Lincoln's policies and the draft. Occasionally, dissent degenerated into violence, most notably the July 1863 riots against the draft in New York City, in which a mostly Irish immigrant mob attacked draft offices, the mansions of wealthy Republicans, industrial establishment, and city blacks. More than 100 people were killed before federal troops ended the tumult. So that was our third section. We'll come back for the next one right now.